Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Guru. I'm Brock Scales. If you haven't already, please subscribe and follow the channel on social media so that way you don't miss out on any updates or new content. There is a major problem plaguing North America, and until recent years, this problem has been widely ignored. And that is the alarming number of missing and murdered Indigenous women throughout the United States and Canada, particularly the province of British Columbia in Canada. And that brings us to today's case. In late December of 1983, 25-year-old Marlene Abigosis vanished from Vancouver's east side without a trace. And nearly 40 years later, we are no closer to the truth of what happened to Marlene than we were then. Marlene Yvonne Abigosis was born on the Pine Creek First Nation Reservation in the province of Manitoba on November 23, 1957. She was the eighth of 14 children to her parents Frank Abigosis and Darlene Campbell. Pine Creek First Nation is very small, with only a population of 645 persons as of 2016, according to Native Ministries International. At a young age, Marlene and her siblings became victims of the Canadian Indian residential school system and were ripped away from their home. If you don't know much about the Canadian residential school system, let me give you a quick rundown. The system dates back to as early as the 17th and 18th century, but really started to become prevalent in the late 1800s. The goal of the school system was to take Indigenous children away from their homes and their families and assimilate them into the rest of the general population through these residential schools. The hopes were that the children would become more like the rest of the general Canadian population, because non-Indigenous Canadians saw the Indigenous people as a threat and thought that assimilating them at a young age would make them easier to contain. So basically, the system was started because of nothing but pure racism. The schools were funded by the Canadian government, but run by Christian churches. At the schools, the children were forbidden from acknowledging their heritage and were faced with serious abuse. There were reports across several generations of Indigenous people that they were faced with both physical and sexual abuse, malnutrition, and starvation, leaving a lot of these children to die. These schools were severely underfunded, so the education that the children were receiving, if any, was minimal. So when the children were ready to enter society, they were at a major disadvantage compared to the rest of the Canadian population, which I'm sure was intentional. The effects of the abuse left a large portion of the Indigenous population with PTSD and other mental illnesses, leading to a spike in suicides among the population, as well as alcoholism and substance abuse. The school system lasted for over 150 years, with the last government-funded school closing as late as 1997. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that the school system was a 150-year-long act of genocide. The lasting effects of the school system are still prevalent today, and Marlene Abigosis was no exception. She and most of her siblings struggled with alcoholism and substance abuse, most of them having died since from complications related to addiction. Marlene was particularly close with her sister Valerie, who was also struggling with alcoholism. Valerie was able to get help through AA, but even at the time of her disappearance, Marlene was still struggling. Marlene was residing on the east side of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is known for its high rates of crime and homelessness. She was relying on survival sex work in order to get by, and was known to have been working near the docks in Vancouver. She reportedly even had a few clients take her on boat trips to the state of Washington in the US, as well as Vancouver Island. It was around Christmas Day in 1983 when Valerie received a late-night phone call at her home in Revelstoke, British Columbia. She was met with Marlene on the other end, crying and stating how unhappy she was in Vancouver, and was looking to start over elsewhere. Valerie later wrote in a letter regarding her sister's disappearance that Marlene was, quote, tired of being tired, end quote. Which I'm sure is a feeling that a lot of us can relate to. Marlene told Valerie on this phone call that she was planning on leaving Vancouver for Calgary, Alberta. Valerie's home in Revelstoke is on the route from Vancouver to Calgary, so she was expecting Marlene to stop by on her journey. But when Marlene had not shown up by New Year's Day, Valerie knew something was terribly wrong. Even though Marlene was going through a lot, she always checked in with family no matter what. This is when Valerie decided to report her sister missing. It is worth noting that the exact date of Marlene Abigosis' disappearance is not known. Depending on the source, her disappearance could be listed as December of 1983. However, since Valerie initially reported Marlene missing on January 1st, 1984, most sources list that as her date of disappearance. But it's highly likely that whatever happened to Marlene Abigosis occurred between Christmas of 1983 and New Year's Day 1984. Some sources even list Marlene's disappearance date as late as March of 1984, and I will explain why here in a minute. When Valerie first reported Marlene missing to the Vancouver Police Department, she says they seemed like they were going to take it seriously. But as soon as they learned that she was living on the east side, their interest quickly faded. Valerie told CBC News that, quote, "I called them several times, and finally an officer told me, 'Well, what do you expect us to do? Get up and jump and start looking as soon as someone reports them missing?' End quote. Yes, that is what we would expect them to do. Valerie was not alone. Many family members of missing Indigenous people in Vancouver report that they received similar attitudes from police, as well as from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP for short. Valerie continued to try to get answers from Vancouver PD to no prevail. She told CBC News, quote, "I couldn't get anywhere. There was nothing that I could do anymore. You know, I'd stopped phoning them," end quote. Marlene was allegedly seen by Vancouver police on March 27, 1984, which is why some sources list that as her date of disappearance. However, this is an unconfirmed sighting, and Valerie was not even told about this sighting initially. This alleged sighting could also explain why Vancouver PD was not taking Marlene's disappearance seriously, coupled with their bias of Vancouver's east side. Valerie wouldn't start pushing again until 2002, when the investigation into one of Canada's most prolific serial killers was underway. In February of 2002, police executed a search warrant on a pig farm belonging to 52-year-old Robert William Picton. Police were searching for illegal firearms, but what they found was much more disturbing. Human remains and bones were found scattered throughout the farm, mostly in the pigsties. The remains would later be identified to belong to missing Indigenous women that were living on Vancouver's east side. Many believe that Robert would kidnap and kill his victims and then later feed them to the pigs. This is why Picton would be dubbed the Pig Farmer Killer. Picton was charged with 26 counts of first-degree murder, but he was only convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder. In 2007, Picton was given the maximum sentence of life without the possibility of parole for 25 years. In Canada, most convicts are eligible for parole at some point in their sentence, no matter how heinous the crime. Since Marlene was a missing Indigenous woman from Vancouver's east side, police started to take her disappearance more seriously, and an official missing persons report would finally be taken on May 22, 2002, nearly 2 decades after Marlene Abigosis was last seen. The fact that it took almost 20 years for this report to be taken is completely unfathomable and extremely frustrating. Police took DNA samples from the home that Marlene was staying in to compare to samples found at Picton's farm, but unfortunately there was no match. The RCMP would eventually contact Valerie and let them know that Marlene's case was being closed, never stating why. How could they close the case without locating Marlene? They simply said there was nothing else that they could do, as if they ever did anything in the first place. With no further assistance from authorities, and now almost 4 decades having gone by, the question of the whereabouts of Marlene Abigosis still stands. Even though there was no DNA of Marlene Abigosis found on Robert Pickton's farm, I don't think that completely discounts the theory that she may have been one of his victims. For starters, the DNA was collected almost 20 years after Marlene Abigosis was last seen, which really makes me question its validity. Also, the fact that Marlene matches the description of Pickton's victimology just makes it all the more likely that she could have been one of his victims. The only thing that makes me question this theory is that all 26 of Pickton's known victims were reported missing throughout the 90s and early 2000s. However, Pickton has confessed to as many as 49 murders, which leaves a lot of people to believe that he was active in the 80s as well, especially since he first inherited the farm in the early 80s. Since it's widely believed that Pickton was feeding his victims to the pigs, it's likely that there may be no trace of some of them left, which is extremely disturbing. Factor all of this, I still think it's possible that Marlene Abigosis could have met her fate at the hands of Robert Pickton. It is also possible that Marlene was met with foul play at the hands of someone else. She was living in a dangerous area and was involved in sex work, which means she was living a quote-unquote high-risk lifestyle. And I say quote-unquote because I don't really like the phrase high-risk lifestyle. I just feel like that it has a sense of victim blaming that doesn't sit right with me. Just because someone is doing things that may cause them harm doesn't mean that they deserve that harm. And it's this so-called high-risk lifestyle that causes authorities to take these crimes less seriously. The only alternative I can come up with is high-risk circumstances. So if anyone watching can come up with a better phrase, I highly encourage it because I am personally not a fan of high-risk lifestyle. There's even a quote that I found on the Native Women's Association of Canada's website. Quote, "It must be emphasized that prostitution is not a cause of violence. Rather, many women experience prostitution in the context of limited options and after experiencing multiple forms of violence." End quote. I honestly could not have said it better myself. Anyway, at the risk of going on too much of a tangent, let me circle back. Having been involved in survival sex work, it is possible that Marlene Abigosis could have been met with foul play this way. Sex workers are common targets for killers, and it's possible that she could have been a victim of opportunity in this manner. And because her disappearance was completely mishandled, that could explain why her remains have not been discovered. Marlene is listed as endangered missing and possible homicide victim on most of the sources I found, which makes it even more confusing as to why her disappearance was not taken as seriously. There is also the chance that Marlene may have taken her own life. She was struggling with alcoholism, and her distressed call to Valerie really showcases the pain that Marlene was going through at the time of her disappearance. However, it is extremely hard to kill yourself and hide your own body. But since police were not really looking for Marlene, it's still a possibility that she may have taken her own life and has yet to be found. There's another angle that could be looked at in Marlene Abigosis' disappearance. Perhaps she did embark on her journey from Vancouver to Calgary, but was involved in some kind of fatal accident along the way. The highway that Marlene would have taken was Canada Highway 1, and this highway does run along several large bodies of water, including the Fraser River, the South Thompson River, and the Shuswap Lake. If Marlene was in some type of accident, she and her vehicle may have ended up in one of these bodies of water, and that's why she has not been found. In the cases of a lot of missing people, they have been discovered inside their vehicles in large bodies of water many years later, So it is always a possibility. As in all missing persons cases, the most hopeful theory is that Marlene left on her own and is still alive and well somewhere. She was obviously unhappy in Vancouver and vocalized that to her sister. Perhaps she did make it to Calgary or somewhere else in Canada and just didn't stop by Valerie's like she had expected. I also can't help but think of her boat trips to Washington State. Perhaps Marlene could have taken one of these trips as an opportunity to start a new life in the United States, as opposed to Canada. This is, of course, the most optimistic theory, but after 40 years, I find it unlikely that Marlene wouldn't have reached out to Valerie or someone to let them know she was okay. Marlene Abigosis is just one of the many missing and murdered Indigenous persons in British Columbia and North America as a whole. And we must ask ourselves, why is this such a widespread issue? According to OAS.org, in British Columbia, jurisdictional issues between the RCMP and the Vancouver Police Department is one of the main reasons these cases go unsolved. And that is the same issue that we see in the United States. There is often confusion between local authorities, reservation authorities, and the FBI about whose responsibility it is to solve these crimes. According to the Native Women's Association of Canada, they have gathered about 160 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in British Columbia, which is over a quarter of all the cases in their database. Also, half of the homicides in British Columbia are committed by perpetrators that are strangers or acquaintances. This is much more compared to the national average of 33%. Crimes committed by strangers are statistically much harder to solve because the possibilities are endless. Another reason that these cases could be so prevalent in British Columbia is because of the deep-rooted discrimination and lack of action from authorities. There are ways that you can help. Two organizations that are working tirelessly to bring resolution to these cases are the MMIW, or Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Organization, and the Native Hope Organization. Donating even a few dollars or just spreading awareness can go a long way in getting these cases the resolution they deserve. Links to both of these amazing organizations are in the episode description. Nearly 40 years have gone by since Marlene Abigosis disappeared, and there are still more questions in this case than there are answers. Was Marlene met with foul play, possibly at the hands of the sadistic Robert Pickton? Or could she not handle the pain anymore and ultimately decided to end her life? Or did she start a new life somewhere and has managed to stay off the grid for this long? Or was she in a terrible accident and for whatever reason her body has not been discovered? I personally feel like these are all possibilities. Valerie told CBC News, quote, "I miss her. I still think of her every day. I have these fantasies where I take off to Europe on a holiday and then I see her. I find her." End quote. At the time of her disappearance, Marlene Abigosis was 25 years old, and today would be 66. She is of First Nation descent and stands at 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighs about 120 pounds. She has brown eyes with wavy black hair. She is known to have gone by several different aliases, which include but is not limited to Clara Ross, Darlene Campbell, and Darlene Richards. If you have any information regarding the whereabouts of Marlene Abigosis, you are urged to call the Vancouver Police Department at 604-717-2530. Thank you everyone for watching and hearing Marlene's story. I highly encourage everyone to look into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Organization and see how you can get involved. If you like this video, please subscribe and hit the like button. And please follow the channel on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, because I love to hear your guys' thoughts on the cases I cover. If you have a case you think I should cover, please email your suggestion to truecrimeguruchannel@gmail.com, or feel free to DM me on social media. Don't miss it next week when I talk about the infamous case of Diane Downs, a woman who was convicted for shooting her 3 young children in cold blood on a dark spring night in 1983.